The boardroom went silent the moment my brother pushed back his chair and pointed straight at me. She has no say anymore. Every head turned. For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. Then my mother slid a thick folder across the polished walnut table without even looking at me. We've already made our decision. She spoke the words with the same calm voice she used when approving quarterly budgets. Only this time, the budget was me. Around the table, every member of my family signed the resolution one after another. Not one person hesitated. Not one person asked me a question. Then the conference room doors opened. 2 security officers stepped inside. One cleared his throat before saying quietly, "Ms. Carter, we've been instructed to escort you from the building." I looked from the guards to my mother, then to Ethan. Neither of them flinched. Neither of them smiled. That somehow hurt even more. As I reached the doorway, I stopped and turned back. "Are you absolutely certain this is your final decision?" Ethan leaned back in the chairman's seat that had belonged to our father for nearly 30 years. "It stopped being your company months ago." I nodded once. No argument. No raised voice. No threats. Just one sentence. "You just erased the wrong person." Laughter followed me into the hallway. None of them understood what those words meant. Not yet. The elevator doors closed behind me, shutting out the voices of the people I'd spent most of my adult life protecting. The reflection in the brushed steel walls barely looked like me anymore. At 34, I had spent almost a decade helping transform Carter Global Holdings from a struggling manufacturing company into a diversified corporation worth more than *1.2 billion*. Every merger, every governance policy, every financing agreement that kept us alive during economic downturns. I'd worked through nights, holidays, and weekends without asking who would receive the credit. Because they were my family. I believed success shared was success multiplied. Looking back, that may have been the most expensive mistake I ever made. My phone vibrated before I reached the lobby. Corporate email access revoked. Another notification appeared seconds later. Executive building credentials disabled. By the time I stepped outside, my office computer had already been remotely logged out. My assistant called in tears. "They're boxing everything in your office, Ashley. They said I can't stop them." "Don't," I replied softly. "Just go home." She hesitated. "But your family." "I know." I ended the call before she could apologize for something that wasn't her fault. Across the street, I watched employees leaving headquarters for the evening. Some noticed me standing there. Most quickly looked away. Inside the building, my family was probably celebrating. To them, removing me from the board was the final step in consolidating their control. They believed they had finally eliminated the one obstacle standing between them and complete authority. By sunset, every trace of me inside headquarters had been erased. My email, my badge, my office, my name from tomorrow's executive schedule. Everything. I drove home in complete silence. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the press. I didn't even call my friends. Instead, I waited. Because there was one thing they had forgotten. Or perhaps, one thing they had never known. Before sunrise the next morning, every member of my family reached for their phones. Their executive dashboards wouldn't load. Bank authorizations failed. Payroll approvals disappeared. Board credentials returned an authentication error. Every executive account inside Carter Global Holdings had been locked simultaneously. Across headquarters, confusion spread faster than panic. Then every executive phone displayed the same notification. Administrative authority has been transferred. No one knew who had done it. No one understood how it was even possible. But somewhere inside headquarters, Someone had just realized the board had made a catastrophic mistake. The first sign that something was changing hadn't been dramatic. It had been quiet. 3 weeks before the board meeting, I walked past conference room B and heard my mother's voice through the partially closed door. "We'll finalize it after Ethan reviews the numbers." I reached for the handle. The conversation stopped. When I stepped inside, half a dozen senior executives looked up at me with the awkward expressions people wear when they're caught discussing someone standing behind them. Margaret smiled almost too quickly. "Oh, Ashley, we were just wrapping up." I looked around the room. Financial projections covered the screen. Expansion plans sat in printed binders. Normally, I would have led meetings like this. Instead, my chair had been removed from the table. "I didn't receive an invitation," I said evenly. Ethan shrugged. "It was operational. Governance wasn't needed." Governance. The word hung in the room. Funny. Whenever negotiations became difficult, whenever regulators raised concerns, whenever investors demanded reassurance, suddenly governance mattered again. I simply nodded. Understood. No one stopped me as I walked back out. Small things kept happening after that. Calendar invitations vanished without explanation. Meetings I had created were suddenly reassigned. Documents that legally required my review somehow reached the board already marked as approved. Each time I questioned it, my mother answered with the same practiced smile. "We're simplifying reporting lines. It's temporary. Don't overthink it." I wanted to believe her. She wasn't just the chairwoman. She was my mother. For years, I'd convinced myself that business disagreements ended at the office and family remained family. But every temporary decision seemed to remove another piece of my responsibility. One afternoon, my executive assistant, Rachel, quietly closed my office door. "Ashley," she lowered her voice, "I don't think this is restructuring." I looked up from a stack of governance reports. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before speaking. "I've been told to copy Ethan on everything before it reaches you." My hand stopped moving. "Who told you?" Rachel swallowed. "I can't say." "You don't have to." Her silence answered the question better than words ever could. That evening, I stayed alone in headquarters long after everyone else had left. The building felt completely different at night. Without conversations echoing through the hallways, I could hear every page turning as I reviewed governance records stored inside our secure archive. Most people assumed my job involved policies, compliance, and endless paperwork. Very few understood what corporate governance actually meant. Every voting structure, every succession clause, every emergency authority, every executive appointment. I had written or revised nearly all of it over the last 9 years. Not because anyone asked me to. Because after our company nearly collapsed during a debt crisis, someone needed to build a system that protected the business from emotional decisions. I believed I was protecting all of us. Now I wasn't so sure. As I compared recent authorization logs against historical records, a pattern slowly emerged. Authority requests were bypassing normal review. Board agenda packets were being redistributed. Certain governance notifications had quietly been redirected away from my office. Individually, each change looked harmless. Together, someone was building a process that no longer included me. Driving home that night, memories I hadn't thought about in years kept replaying. I remembered negotiating with lenders while Ethan attended networking dinners. I remembered rewriting financing agreements at 3 a.m. because one missing clause could have cost us millions. I remembered sleeping on the office couch during acquisition week while reporters praised my brother for his remarkable leadership. At family celebrations, relatives would clap Ethan on the back. "You're turning this company into something incredible. He always smiled. Thanks. He never corrected them. Not once. Meanwhile, my mother introduced me to distant relatives with the same sentence every Thanksgiving. Ashley keeps all the paperwork organized. Paperwork. That single word erased years of negotiations, strategy, and legal architecture. I laughed it off every time. Because correcting my own family felt petty. Because I believed recognition wasn't as important as results. Because I thought they knew the truth, even if they never said it aloud. I was wrong. A week before the board meeting, I visited my father. Retirement hadn't suited him. Years of stress had finally forced him away from the company he had built from a single warehouse into an international corporation. He sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm afternoon. You look tired, he observed. So do you. He chuckled softly. I earned it. For a while, we talked about everything except business. Finally, he looked directly at me. Your mother and Ethan have been spending a lot of time together lately. I've noticed. They've always underestimated what you actually do. I know. He became unusually serious. Never underestimate what ambitious people convince themselves they're entitled to. I frowned. Is there something you're trying to tell me? He looked toward the garden, instead of answering immediately. Just promise me something. What? If they ever make you choose between protecting the company and protecting their feelings. He paused. Choose the company. It was such an oddly specific warning that I almost laughed. Instead, I promised him. At the time, I thought he was simply worried about family disagreements. I had no idea how soon those words would matter. The official board meeting notice arrived 2 days later. I opened the email while drinking my morning coffee. The subject line read, Special Board Strategy Session. I scanned the attendee list once. Then again. Then a third time. My name wasn't there. I called the corporate secretary immediately. I think there's been a mistake. There was a long silence. Finally, she whispered. There wasn't. The line went dead. The next morning, I got dressed anyway. If my family wanted to tell me I no longer belonged, they were going to have to do it to my face. As I walked toward the boardroom, I saw 2 uniformed security officers standing outside the doors. One of them looked at me with unmistakable sympathy. The other reached for his radio. For the first time, I realized this wasn't simply a meeting I hadn't been invited to. It was a meeting designed to erase me. By the time I reached the boardroom doors, the meeting had already begun. Through the glass wall, I could see every familiar face seated around the table. My mother sat where my father had once presided over every quarterly meeting. Ethan occupied the CEO's chair beside her. Department presidents, outside directors, and senior executives flipped through thick binders bearing the Carter Global logo. No one looked toward the hallway. It was as if they had already decided I no longer existed. One of the security officers stepped forward. I'm sorry, Ms. Carter. I know. He lowered his voice. They instructed us not to let you enter. I looked through the glass one last time. Then I placed my hand on the door anyway. The room fell silent. Every head turned toward me. My mother sighed. Let her in. The guard reluctantly opened the door. The room felt colder than usual. I walked to my usual seat. Ethan spoke before I could even pull out the chair. That seat is no longer assigned to you. I stopped. What exactly is happening? Margaret folded her hands neatly. A restructuring. You don't restructure governance without notifying the governance officer. We already have. I looked around the room. Does anyone else believe this complies with company policy? No one answered. Several directors avoided eye contact. Others stared down at their notes. One outside executive looked genuinely uncomfortable but remained silent. The silence hurt more than the accusation. My own work had taught these people that procedure mattered. Today, procedure had disappeared because the people violating it were family. Ethan stood and pressed a button on the conference screen. A presentation appeared. Leadership transition plan. My photograph faded into a gray box labeled Former Executive Authority. He smiled confidently. As of today, operational leadership has been consolidated. My eyes stayed on the slide. You prepared this before today's vote. Of course we did. So the outcome was predetermined. Margaret answered without hesitation. We simply formalized what was already necessary. Necessary. Such a clean word for betrayal. I turned toward the independent directors. Did anyone receive the governance review attached to this proposal? Confused expressions spread around the room. What governance review? One director asked. Ethan interrupted immediately. It wasn't required. I didn't argue. I simply noticed who looked surprised. That would matter later. Margaret slid a formal resolution toward the center of the table. The board will now vote. No discussion. No questions. No legal review. Pens moved across paper. One signature. Then another. Then another. Every signature carried the same message. Ashley Carter no longer belonged. When the final page reached my mother, she signed slowly before looking directly into my eyes. The resolution passes. Ethan smiled. I'll need your executive badge. I removed it from my jacket and placed it gently on the table. No dramatic gesture. No anger. Just acceptance. He seemed disappointed. He had expected a fight. The head of corporate security entered with 2 officers. Escort Ms. Carter from the building. One guard hesitated. Sir. Now. The room watched as I gathered my notebook. Nothing else. Everything else in the office could be replaced. Not my integrity. As we walked toward the exit, I noticed employees gathering outside nearby offices. Whispers spread faster than footsteps. Is she being fired? I thought she ran governance. I heard she lost a board vote. No, Ethan's taking over everything. Phones quietly appeared. Someone was already recording. The story would travel through headquarters long before the official announcement did. Less than 30 minutes later, every employee received a company-wide email. Leadership update. It announced that I had voluntarily stepped away from executive responsibilities to pursue personal priorities. I read it from my car parked across the street. For a moment, I almost laughed. Voluntarily. I'd just been escorted out by security. Rachel called immediately. They're making everyone sign acknowledgement forms. What kind? That Ethan is now your replacement. Have you signed? No. Don't refuse. What? Sign it. But it's false. I know. She was silent. You'll understand soon. Instead of driving home, I headed downtown to a quiet office building most Carter executives had never entered. The brass plaque beside the elevator simply read, Independent Governance Trustee. The receptionist greeted me without surprise. They're expecting you. Inside, the trustee stood as I entered. He closed the office door himself. Neither of us sat down immediately. He studied my face for several seconds, then asked only one question. So, they officially removed me. His expression changed. Publicly, in front of the full board. He slowly nodded. I was hoping they'd never force this. I handed him a certified copy of the board resolution. He reviewed every page carefully. When he reached the signatures, he closed the folder. There can be no misunderstanding now. I met his eyes. No. He reached for a secured telephone that had probably remained untouched for years. After entering a long authentication code, he spoke only one sentence. Activate protective authority verification. He hung up. I frowned slightly. What happens now? He looked at me calmly. Exactly what your father prepared for. Before I could ask another question, phones throughout Carter Global Headquarters began vibrating at exactly the same moment. Across dozens of executive computers, one identical message appeared. No one moved. The sealed envelope remained in the center of the boardroom, as if simply touching it might change what was inside. Margaret was the first to speak. What is this? The lead governance attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the table at every director who had voted the previous afternoon. I need everyone to understand something before I open this. Ethan folded his arms. We don't have time for speeches. This isn't a speech. The attorney's tone remained calm. It's a warning. The room fell silent again. He carefully broke the seal. Inside was a thick governance agreement bearing the original signatures of the company's founder, outside counsel, and the independent trustee. At the bottom, my father's signature. The attorney adjusted his glasses. 8 years ago, Carter Global Holdings experienced a liquidity crisis that nearly resulted in a hostile acquisition. Several directors nodded. They remembered. Most had lived through it. At that time, he continued, the founder instructed outside counsel to create a governance structure that would permanently prevent any individual or any family faction from taking operational control through internal politics. Margaret frowned. I know about the restructuring. You know part of it. He opened to a bookmarked page. The complete structure was confidential. He slid the agreement toward the center of the table. Every eye followed the highlighted paragraph. The founder established an emergency governance authority that supersedes board action whenever executive removal procedures violate the governance charter. Ethan leaned forward. So, the attorney looked directly at him. The holder of that authority is the Chief Corporate Governance Officer. The room went completely still. He turned one more page. The position has one permanent designee. His finger stopped beside a single name. ASHLY Carter. Nobody spoke. Margaret reached for the document herself. She read the page once. Then again. No. Her voice barely came out. This can't be right. It is. We're the controlling shareholders. You own shares, the attorney replied. That is not the same as controlling governance. Ethan snatched the agreement from the table. This says she can suspend executive authority. The attorney nodded. When governance protections are triggered. And yesterday triggered them. Immediately. Because we voted. No. The attorney looked directly at him. Because you removed the governance officer without following the procedures that she herself designed, and that this board unanimously adopted years ago. The room became painfully quiet. Every signature from yesterday suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. The independent trustee entered a few moments later. No one had invited him. He simply walked into the room, carrying another folder. I've completed verification. Margaret stood. You could have stopped this. No. I legally could not. He placed the verification report beside the original agreement. The protective authority activated automatically at 5:42 p.m. yesterday. He looked toward the directors. Not because Ashley requested it. Several heads lifted. What? It activated because your board actions satisfied every condition specified by the founder. He pointed toward the report. The account suspensions. The banking authorization holds. The executive credential lockouts. The governance review. Every one of them occurred automatically. Ethan stared at him. So she didn't lock us out herself. The trustee answered carefully. She exercised her lawful authority after your actions activated the protections. A director slowly removed his glasses. So, we caused this. Yes. While the boardroom struggled to absorb the truth, I remained in the downtown conference room with independent counsel. No television. No celebration. Just paperwork. One attorney looked up from the final governance report. Everything has been confirmed. I nodded. What happens next? The independent directors have already voted. They're inviting you back as acting chair. I sat quietly. Another attorney asked, "Will you accept?" I looked out the window before answering. "I'll accept responsibility." He smiled slightly. "But I won't accept revenge." An hour later, I walked back into Carter Global Headquarters. This time, no security officers blocked the entrance. Instead, the lobby manager hurried toward me. "Good morning, Ms. Carter." His voice shook. We're glad you're here." Employees turned as I crossed the lobby. Whispers followed. "She's back. I thought she was fired. Then why is legal escorting her upstairs?" The elevator doors opened. Not one word was spoken during the ride. When they opened again, the boardroom doors were already waiting. The independent directors stood as I entered. No one else did. Not yet. The lead director pulled out the chair at the head of the table. "Ashley, this seat belongs to the acting chair." For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then Margaret quietly lowered her eyes. Ethan slowly pushed his own chair back. Without a single argument, I took the chairperson's seat. The meeting that followed lasted almost 4 hours. Every action from the previous day was reviewed. Every vote was examined. Every procedural violation was documented. By unanimous vote of the independent directors, the prior resolutions removing me were declared null and void. The investigation expanded immediately. Outside counsel began reviewing whether board members had breached their fiduciary duties. Several executives retained private attorneys before the meeting even ended. 2 senior officers resigned that afternoon. 3 more resigned before the end of the week. The board authorized a full governance audit to restore confidence among investors and regulators. When markets opened the following Monday, Carter Global issued a public statement, not denying the internal conflict, but confirming that the company's governance safeguards had functioned exactly as designed. Investors responded with cautious confidence. The company's stability had not depended on personalities. It had depended on its governance. The hardest conversation came later that evening. My mother knocked on my office door. For the first time in years. She knocked. "You have a minute." I looked up from my desk. "Come in." She sat across from me without speaking. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Finally, she asked, "When did your father do this?" "Years ago. He never told me. He believed someone needed to protect the company from family." Tears gathered in her eyes. "You think we're the threat?" I answered honestly. "No. I think power without accountability is." She looked around the office. "I thought you wanted control." I shook my head. "I wanted the company protected." Another long silence. Then she whispered, "I didn't realize how much of it was you." For the first time in my life. She said it aloud. It came years too late. But it was finally true. Ethan never apologized. Not directly. Instead, his attorney contacted mine regarding his resignation package. The board accepted his resignation after determining he had knowingly bypassed mandatory governance procedures. Margaret stepped down as chair several weeks later. She remained a shareholder, but voluntarily surrendered all executive authority. The company moved forward under an entirely different structure. Future executive appointments required approval from independent directors. Family relationships no longer guaranteed leadership positions. Every executive would now be evaluated on competence, performance, and accountability. Exactly as the governance charter had always intended. Months later, Carter Global was stronger than it had ever been. The leadership team included experienced professionals from outside the family. Board meetings became quieter, more disciplined. Decisions were challenged instead of inherited. Employees who had once whispered in hallways now openly shared ideas without worrying about family politics. Rachel stopped by my office one afternoon, carrying a stack of governance reports. She smiled. "You know." "What?" "The building feels different." I looked through the glass walls toward teams working together across the executive floor. "It is." She laughed. "No. It's finally the company everyone thought it already was." I smiled. She was right. For years, I'd believed protecting my family meant staying invisible. I had mistaken silence for loyalty. The day they had security remove me, my family believed they had taken away my power. What they actually removed was the only person keeping theirs alive. Conclusion complete. Full script generated. At 6:07 the following morning, Ethan stormed into headquarters carrying 2 phones. Neither one had stopped ringing since dawn. The executive floor, usually quiet and meticulously organized, had dissolved into controlled chaos. His executive assistant hurried toward him. "Good morning, sir." "It doesn't look like a good morning." "No, sir." She handed him a tablet. "I've already received 43 reports." He barely glanced at it. "What happened?" "Nobody knows." Inside the executive suite, department heads crowded around the operations center. The chief financial officer spoke first. "I can't authorize wire transfers." The chief operating officer interrupted. "I've lost access to every manufacturing dashboard. Our overseas divisions can't process supplier payments. The payroll system is frozen. The treasury portal rejected my credentials." Every sentence added another problem. Every problem pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Someone had removed executive authority across the company. Ethan slammed his hand onto the conference table. "This is a cyber attack." The chief information officer immediately shook his head. "We thought so too." "You thought?" "We've spent 3 hours verifying." "So?" "No malware. No external breach. No ransom demand. No network intrusion." Ethan stared. "Then explain why nobody can get into anything." The CIO hesitated. "The system says access wasn't hacked." He swallowed. "It says it was, revoked." The room went silent. Margaret arrived 10 minutes later. Unlike Ethan, she wasn't shouting. That worried people more. She calmly walked to the center of the room. "Status?" The chief financial officer answered first. "Payroll approvals are suspended." "Our banks?" "They're refusing executive authorizations." Margaret frowned. "Refusing?" "They're recognizing a governance hold." "A what?" "A governance hold." The company's general counsel looked up sharply. "Repeat that." "The banks say executive authority is suspended pending governance verification." Margaret's expression hardened. "Who requested verification?" "No one knows." She looked directly at Ethan. "Call the banks yourself." "I already did." "And?" They all gave the same answer. Every single one. Across the building, confusion spread floor by floor. Managers couldn't approve hearing. Regional presidents couldn't access budgets. Contract signatures stalled. International shipments waited for approvals that never came. Employees gathered outside offices whispering, "I've never seen the executive floor like this. Did somebody resign?" I heard federal regulators got involved. No, I heard the systems locked themselves. Rumors spread faster than facts. The communications department attempted to draft a company-wide explanation. They couldn't publish it. Even communication approvals required executive authorization, which no longer existed. Outside consultants arrived before 9 o'clock. Cybersecurity specialists unpacked equipment. Forensic analysts connected diagnostic tools. Server engineers searched for evidence of intrusion. Hours passed. Nothing. Finally, the lead cybersecurity consultant removed his glasses and looked at Ethan. "This isn't an attack." "Then what is it?" "The system is behaving exactly as it was designed." "What does that even mean?" "It means whoever initiated this." He paused carefully. "Had legitimate authority." Ethan laughed once. "No." The consultant didn't smile. "I wish I were wrong." Meanwhile, I sat inside a conference room nearly 20 miles away. No cameras. No reporters. No celebration. Only 3 independent directors, outside legal counsel, and the governance trustee. A pot of untouched coffee sat in the middle of the table. One attorney reviewed the previous day's board resolution line by line. Another compared it against corporate bylaws. Nobody rushed. Nobody speculated. Facts mattered here. The trustee finally looked toward me. "You haven't contacted your family." "No." "You haven't spoken publicly." "No." "You understand they'll accuse you." I expected that yesterday. One independent director leaned forward. "Do you want revenge?" I answered immediately. "No." "What do you want?" "The company protected." He nodded once. "Good." Back at headquarters, Margaret ordered an emergency board meeting. Every available director arrived within an hour. Some looked exhausted. Others looked frightened. One independent director placed yesterday's resolution on the conference table. "We need legal guidance." The general counsel entered carrying several thick governance binders. "I've reviewed every action taken yesterday." "What did you find?" Margaret asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to a junior attorney. "Bring me the governance archive." Minutes later, a sealed storage case was placed on the table. Inside were original governance documents signed years earlier. The attorney carefully sorted through them. One clause caught his attention. He stopped reading. "Then read it again." His face changed. "What is it?" Ethan demanded. The attorney slowly looked up. "I need the original governance agreement." "Why?" "Because this clause references an authority that wasn't disclosed in yesterday's meeting." The room became uncomfortably quiet. Margaret frowned. "What authority?" "I don't know yet. But if this clause means what I think it means." He closed the binder. "Yesterday's vote may not have had the legal effect you believed." No one spoke. For the first time since removing me, uncertainty replaced confidence. At that exact moment, the conference room doors opened. The company's lead outside governance attorney walked inside carrying a sealed document envelope. Every conversation stopped. He placed the envelope carefully in the center of the table, then looked around the room. His voice was calm, but every word landed like concrete. "Everyone needs to stop talking." He rested one hand on the sealed agreement. "Immediately."